mentioning a little bit about, just a minute here. I'm glad to be with you this evening. And Gary's Mill settlement is indeed a very interesting settlement to me. And I trust that by the time we're finished with this presentation this evening, it'll just be equally interesting to you, because it is really a remarkable place that no longer exists. And I say that with much sadness, because I think that we should have some form of a recognition in our community for the Gary's Mill settlement, more than just simply the road that says Gary's Mill Road, and a little marker that shows up on the Prairie Path Trail. But anyway, Gary's Mill settlement is remarkable for several reasons. And this is what I'm going to say next. You'll probably find to be unbelievable, but it's true. I believe that what happened because of Gary's Mill settlement had a marked benefit to us. It made the United States able to win the Second World War. That little settlement had a significant, major impact on our ability to win that war. Now, you probably say that can't be. How could that be? It's just a small little settlement that doesn't even exist anymore. By the time this presentation is over, I trust that you'll agree with me. Gary's Mill settlement also had a role in the Underground Railroad. And that's when the African-American slaves before the Civil War were making their way through the South and then through states in the North, working their way to Canada. And one of the stops along the way was Gary's Mill settlement. And I think that's noteworthy as well. Gary's Mill settlement also had a lot to do with the development of the Industrial Revolution for the United States. The fact that we were able to advance at the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s, become a major world power, had a lot to do with, guess what? Guess who? Gary's Mill settlement. Once again, these are statements that I think are outrageous just to make them, but they're true. And as we go forward in this presentation, you'll see why. But the first pioneers of the Gary's Mill settlement were those who founded the Illinois Territory. And you can see on the map in the pink how large that territory originally was. And it was initially part of the state of Virginia, or at that time the country, or the state of Virginia. And but then Virginia let go of it and allowed it to be on its own. And eventually, Illinois itself was named for the lower part of this territory, and as we know the state as it is today. The settlement, the American settlement of this part of Illinois was not possible because in the early 1800s, the Indians were there. And then when the Indians were pushed on the west side of the Mississippi River, which is very controversial today, whether we should have done that or not. Most historians now believe that the Indians were treated poorly and incorrectly, but it happened. And the Indians, so the Indians were pushed out of their land, which was on the east side of the Mississippi River, to the west side of the Mississippi River, and they did not like it. So they fought back, and that was the Black Hawk War of 1832. And Black Hawk was a general on the Indian side who had a number of raids taking place to the early settlers that were in the northern part of Illinois. But that didn't last very long. He was conquered and he was pushed out again. And the Indians were once again on the west side of the Mississippi River. And that made it possible for settlements to really take off in northern Illinois. And Fort Dearborn, which is the original name of Chicago, was all that there was on that in that area at the time. And they from that fort, 3 trails were made their way to the Fox River, going west. And you can see on the map there, you can see the 3 trails. One was a little bit to the north, center, and to the south. The one on the north is essentially today follows the route of Lake Street. The one in the center follows what is now today Roosevelt Road. And in the one on the south follow what is today Ogden Avenue, going to the Fox River. So that's why those roads have the trajectory that they have today, which is not, it's kind of angular, except for Roosevelt Road, which goes straight due west. But that's where the settlers would just walk, or with usage of wagons, would just travel until they found a spot that they could claim to be their own. And then they would settle there and make that their home. And here's a map of the different battles that took place during the Black Hawk Wars. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, claims to have been part of that war. And this is a statement that he made. He said, "By the way, Mr. Speaker," referring to the Speaker of the House, "did you know that I am a military hero? Yes, sir. In the days of the Black Hawk War, I fought, bled, and came away. I was not at Stillman's defeat." Stillman's defeat would be right where my cursor is hovering, which is present day Rockford. "I was not at Stillman's defeat, but I was about as near as Cass and was Hull's surrender, and like him, I saw the place very soon afterwards." And there is a monument there to commemorate that battle. Now, there were numbers of people that were interested in settling the northern Illinois area, including the Garys and the Wheatons. Garys, both of these families were founders of many areas that are around us right now. But they lived in a place called Pomfret, Connecticut. You can see that over here on the right map, where I'm hovering my cursor. And that was their home. And they wanted to move west. And the reason for that was they knew there was land available, and they wanted to find more land for themselves, because land was the way of success in that day. So what they would do is what Erastus Gary, the first of the Garys, what he did was he worked his way up the Hudson River to the Erie Canal, which had just been finished. And he took the Erie Canal all the way to Lake Erie. And then from Lake Erie, he boarded a ship, and the ship went through the Lake Erie, then around into Lake Huron, and then around from there to Lake Michigan, and then it docked at Fort Dearborn. And then at Fort Dearborn is where he got off, and he started walking. And he walked westward on what is now Roosevelt Road, or was at the time was the Central Trail. And he was so impressed with the land that he was given that he sent for Charles Gary, his brother, to come out. And so Charles Gary followed the same route, and he came out in 1837. And he took Erastus Gary's sawmill along the west branch of the DuPage River. Now here's a drawing of that sawmill, and this sawmill no longer exists. But where it did exist would be on Gary's Mill Road, where Gary's Mill Road crosses the Page River just before you get to Route 53, or Route 59. If you were heading westward on Gary's Mill Road, just before you cross that bridge, if you were to look to your left, which would be looking southward, you would, and just look maybe a 200 yards. That is where you would see Gary's Mill sawmill if it was still standing today. Now, at that same spot at the river, at the bridge, if you spin around and look northward across Gary's Mill Road, you would see a house still standing today. That is, or was, Charles Gary's house. And here's a picture of it today. I took this photograph from the road, from Gary's Mill Road at the bridge. And you can just drive by and look at it all you want. And I had the fortune, as I was looking at it one day, that the owner of the house, the current owner, came out to see me. And I mentioned I was looking at it because I was interested in Charles Gary. And he said, "Oh yeah, this is Charles Gary's house." And then he said, "Would you like to come in?" And I said, "Oh, would I ever?" So he let me take a tour of his home. And I was able to go in the upper store and main floor. And all these wood, all the wood in that house was produced through the Gary's Mill sawmill. And I also noticed as I was walking on the floor, the floorboards, it creaked. And I would just imagine that's probably because this house was built back in the early 1800s. And I'm sure it over the course of the years, it has gotten a little bit old and creaky. Now here to the right is the Gary's Mill School. Now, again, this school no longer exists. But if you were to be at that bridge, same spot where I'm encouraging you to go, you'll notice that there's a trail, like a bicycle trail, going off the road heading south. And if you were to just take that trail and just take maybe 100 steps, you'd see a marker where they say this is where the schoolhouse once was. This schoolhouse is a 2-room schoolhouse, and it was there until the mid 20th century. And we'll talk more about this later. But this schoolhouse, it was torn down, and I'm so sorry that it was torn down, because there is so much history in that schoolhouse that has national implications. But it got torn down, and the people fought to keep it, but in order to keep it, they had to come up with the money to be able to move it or to repair it, and they were not able to find such funds, and therefore it was destroyed. Now here are the Gary, the family of the Garys and the Wheatons, and by the way, they intermarried. The Garys, the Wheatons married the sisters, and they went. So they became an in-law family. Jude Gary, there's no photo of him. He was one of the brothers. Unfortunately, there's no photograph that I was able to find of Charles Gary, but he to me was a major figure. And then Erastus Gary was the first of the Garys to make that trip from Connecticut. And then there's Orinda Gary, who married Jessie Wheaton. And then there's Warren Wheaton. And the Wheatons, by the way, had a major role to play in the establishment of Wheaton College. This is the promised land, the Garys often said, of DuPage County. Now, here you'll see the parcels. The U.S. government was giving out parcels at a very inexpensive. I don't have with me right now the price, but it was very, very inexpensive. And these are quarter miles. If you were to take 4 of these squares and put them together, you'd have a square mile. And the Garys, Charles Gary had his parcel right where his house is. And his house would be right about where my cursor is hovering over that square. And then that's where that is where the river was. No, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong spot. His house would be down here, where my cursor is hovering, near the lower left corner. And that you can see Gary's Mill Road just follows along, and that is where his house is, and the mail will be right here in the absolute lower corner of his parcel. And the Wheatons had their parcels here, where I'm now to the east of it, and then further to the east would be another parcel that they had, which became the city of Wheaton. Now, again, here's a photograph of Charles Gary's house, and here's where it's located along the river, on the edge of Gary's Mill Road. And this is the house of Jessie Wheaton. His house is still standing today on Evergreen Street on Roosevelt Road, just a little bit to the east of Warrenville Road on Evergreen Street. And you can see it today. If you were just to take the Warrenville Road from north, if you were to go on Roosevelt Road, turn north on Warrenville Road, just a block, you'll be at Evergreen. Then you turn east, and then you look south, and there it is. That's Jesse Wheaton's house, still standing. This is Warren Wheaton's house. Now, his house is on the corner of Naperville Road and Roosevelt Road. This would be on the northeast corner. Now, this is a photograph I took a couple years ago, and that's how the house looked when Warren Wheaton owned it. But the new owners of Warren's house have done some major renovations. If you were to look at it today, you'll see a large new section to the house extending toward Roosevelt Road that is brand new. And I was kind of heartbroken when I saw that, because that's not historically the way it was. And I just kind of wish that they would have maintained the integrity of the house, because it is such an important part of our history here. But nonetheless, that's the house, and that's where you can see it if you're just driving down Roosevelt Road. Now, here's a class photo of that little 2-room schoolhouse. And this is one that was taken in 1896, and another one in 1893. Not many students there. It was just a small little school. It was the only school in the area until they built the public school in Winfield, which became a competing school. And then later there was the John the Baptist Catholic Church had a school as well. So eventually there were 3 schools in the area. Now here's a wedding. The wedding for Gary's. The wedding took place at the little schoolhouse with Jesse Wheaton and Orinda Gary. And it was Gary's Mill School that Jesse Wheaton and Orinda Gary exchanged their wedding vows, including a romance which Rufus Blanchard described in his 1882 History of DuPage County, Illinois, by saying, "Cupid is more unerring in his darts than new countries." And they loved each other deeply. Here's a map of the Gary's Mill settlement as it was at the time. Now, again, you can see Gary's Mill Road. This is Roosevelt Road, extending to the diagonal. And here is Gary's Mill Road cutting off, and you can drive it today if you wish. And then right here is where it crosses the river, right here. Now, when this photograph was taken, the road stopped right here. But today the road continues on to Route 59. But here you can see Gary's, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This is Route 59. And this is the river right here. And it was here where the sawmill was. And here is where the school was, the 2-room schoolhouse. This is Charles Gary's house, which is still standing today. And this is the Gary's Mill Settlement Cemetery right here. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the cemetery. It was, if you look if you do research on it like I did, people will say, nobody knows where the Gary's Mill Settlement Cemetery is located. And then you'll find other authors that will say the Gary's Mill Settlement Cemetery is one and the same with the John the Baptist Church Cemetery, which is also located on Gary's Mill Road, but further to the east. Both of these are wrong. This here is the cemetery right there. Now, the reason why I know that is because when I did my research, when I was allowed into the house of Charles Gary, the current owner, also showed me some documents that he had kept, because he had been doing his own research on Charles Gary as well. And the documents he had a document which definitively diagrammed the location of Gary's Mill Settlement Cemetery, which makes perfect sense because it was right there at the settlement. And he said there's the trail, according to the document, there was a trail leading from from Gary's Mill, from Charles Gary's house all the way to the cemetery. And he said, you can still see parts of that trail today. So we got outside the house and he walked me from the house going north. He said, see the trail? You can see stones deep in the ground and the flat stone, just like what we'd have today as to mark a trail. And they're still there. And it goes all the way to this point right here. Now, right here, there is a housing apartments right here now. And this spot where the cemetery was is now part of their parking lot. Now you would say, oh, how horrible that they paved asphalt on top of a cemetery. Well, not so. What they did was they disinterred the bodies that were in the cemetery first. And then they moved them over to a brand new cemetery that had just been put together at which is now called the Wheaton Cemetery along Wheaton Warrenville Road, south of Roosevelt Road. So these bodies that were originally buried here were moved to that new cemetery. So it wasn't as if they paved over the cemeteries. They did move the bodies first, and I was thankful to see that, to hear about that. Now, Charles Gary was, not only was he the man who ran the sawmill, he also was a dedicated Methodist Christian. And at first, the church services for the Methodists, the only Methodist church in the area, was held at that 2-room schoolhouse. And Charles Gary was the pastor. Now, they outgrew it because they had so many people. And so they was no longer functional to use it as a church. So they moved the church to what's now West Chicago, but at the time was called Turner Junction. And this is the church which is still standing today, which was originally the Methodist Episcopalian Church, and Charles Gary was the original pastor. Today it's called the Arbor Community Church of West Chicago, and it's along a street called Church Street, which is very appropriate for the name. But it's just a little bit north of Roosevelt Road in West Chicago. Also a little bit just a tad to the south of the railroad tracks. This is where Charles Gary is now buried. But like I said, this is this marker, and his body is buried at the Wheaton Cemetery in Wheaton. An obituary published in the Wheaton, Illinois, commented that Charles Gary had built such a large niche in the history of DuPage County, and as a minister of the gospel, his labors have been very great. His only regret was that he could not preach once more. He loved the gospel, he loved the Lord Jesus Christ, and he loved to preach. And he just that was his first. That he thought of that as his first calling. He did many other things that we'll see in a moment, but one, of course, was that he was in charge of the sawmill. And here is a diagram that goes back in time. You can see here's Gary's Mill Road, and this is that little road next to the house that goes right back to the cemetery, as it was diagrammed originally. Now, there was a circuit preacher that was also in DuPage County at the time, by the name of Stephen R. Beggs. He was a Methodist circuit preacher, and he did this for several decades. He was that was his calling, and that was his, so to speak, his parish. It was the entire county of DuPage, and his goal was to plant as many Methodist churches as he could in the county. He lived in what's now present-day Plainfield, Illinois, and he had several wives. Now, it wasn't because he got divorced or divorced these women. It was because they would die. I mean, he would marry a woman, and then she would die, and then he'd marry someone else, and then she would die. I believe he had 3 wives, and the reason for their deaths is because life as a pioneer in this world back in the early 1800s was very hard, and women worked probably harder than the men, and their bodies wore out, and so that's why he had several wives. And during he was there during the Black Hawk uprising, and he heard, which was incorrect. He heard rumors that that Black Hawk was going to attack Plainfield. So he made his house into a fortress, and was just putting logs around his house, and then he encouraged all the Plainfield people to come in and fight off the Indians when they came. But of course, this was just a false rumor, and there was no battle. But fearing an attack by Black Hawk and his band of Indians, Reverend Beggs converted his home into a makeshift fort and gathered the people of Plainfield to the fort, bracing for the attack. The attack never came. But afterwards, the people were so frightened that attack may yet come, that some of them went back to Fort Dearborn, which is now present-day Chicago, because they thought that'd be more safe to live there. A 200-pound, 6-foot-tall son of a Revolutionary War veteran, Beggs had such a voice that one pioneer said that he could be heard a quarter of a mile away. To settlements as far flung as 12 miles south of Ottawa, he traveled with stops in Downers Grove, Naperville. Beggs wrote the book Pages from the Early History of the West and Northwest. I have a copy of that book. You can get it on the internet, and you can also you can read a copy if you wish at the Historical Museum in Plainfield. And this tells you the story, his entire story of serving as a itinerant preacher throughout DuPage County. It's a fascinating read. This was his whole area that he actually extended himself beyond DuPage County here, and he would actually hold meetings further to the west in DeKalb and south. During the Civil War, he left this area entirely, and became a chaplain for the Union Army, and he would be a chaplain for the soldiers before and after battle. Now, it's interesting to me that back in these days, there was a contrast between Christmas and Thanksgiving. The Catholics celebrated Christmas, but they refused to celebrate Thanksgiving. And the Protestants celebrated Thanksgiving, but they refused to celebrate Christmas. Now, the reason for that was back in those days, you didn't have the celebration of extension of gifts like we have today, where it becomes the center of the whole celebration of Christmas. In that day, Christmas was just a worship service, and it was called Christ's Mass, and it was a worship service, and its liturgy was Catholic. And that was the big reason why the Protestants had nothing to do with it, because they did not believe in the doctrines of the Catholic Church. But the Catholics did, of course. Now, the Catholics refused to participate in Thanksgiving because they saw it as a Protestant event. And historically it was. It was the Puritans who came across from England were those who celebrated the first Thanksgiving, and the Puritans were Protestants. So the Catholics refused to celebrate Thanksgiving, but they did celebrate Christmas, and reverse was true of the Protestants. So that's the way it was back in those days. Totally different from the way it is today. Around the turn of the century, from around 1900 and on, the culture changed and the attitudes changed, and people of all faiths began to celebrate Christmas, and people of all faiths began to celebrate Thanksgiving. But that was not the way it was in the early part of the 1800s. Christmas versus Thanksgiving. Here, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, first published in 1843, helped broaden the Christmas appeal. Christmas became an official federal holiday in 1870. But that book, The Christmas Carol, was so popular as a novel, and everyone was reading it. Then it caused the Protestants to start taking Christmas more seriously. Here is an aerial photo of the Garys Mill settlement, 1939. And by this time, the settlement was gone. But the settlement, this is here you can see a picture of the cemetery. And Charles Gary's house will be right here, and the sawmill will be right about here. You don't see the homes anymore. They were torn down. They were just small shacks. But all in this area right here, is kind of like this triangle. This is where the settlement was. And what Charles Gary did was he sold off parts of his property into small segments, and people built homes there. And this became Gary's Mill settlement. Winfield was originally called was part of Gary's Mill settlement. Gary's Mill settlement had its own post office and had its own school, like we already seen. And the school served as a church, had its own cemetery. So it was a up and coming community. And in Winfield, which was a little bit to the north over here where I'm showing my cursor, there was hardly any home, just some farms. So these farms had no way to identify who they were or where they belonged. So they said they were part of Gary's Mill settlement, even though they were kind of outside of the settlement, specifically speaking, but they're close enough that they call themselves Gary's Mill settlement. And there you see the cemetery again, the house, sawmill, and school. Methodist Church in Warrenville was built with the wood that came from the Gary's Mill. And Charles Gary also had a role in the founding of that church. And here's another shot of that same church. It's still standing today. It's not used as a church, but that's what it was originally. And here's another shot of it early in 1883, what it looked like back then. You can see cars there. And today it's being used in part as the Albright Theater Company, where they hold plays. And for example, they hold the Christmas Carol there. And it's also being used today as a museum. Okay, politics. Charles Gary, when they organized DuPage County as a county, they then divided up the townships. And the Winfield Township was organized in 1850. And in that township, here we see Charles Gary. And his role, he was the overseer of the poor. Because the poor people, he made sure that the poor people did not fall into total destitution, that they would be cared for one way or another. And that was his job. And he took it. And you can just see that's the kind of man Charles Gary was. He took his faith, Christian faith, seriously, and that meant taking care of the poor. He also served as a supervisor of Winfield Township in 1853, 1854, and 1857. He also again served as the overseer of the poor in 1851 and 1857. And he served as a justice of the peace in 1854, 1855, and 1857. Now, what's interesting about his role as justice of the peace, that meant he was the chief officer of the law in those particular years. And in those same years, 1854, 55, and 57, the Underground Railroad was in operation, and he was harboring these runaway slaves in his home, while at the same time serving as a justice of the peace. So here you have a man who was sworn to uphold the law and as being the justice of the peace, but at the same time, the same years, he was breaking the law by harboring runaway slaves. And if he was caught, he would have been put in prison and fined a very hefty sum of money. But to me, it's an interesting contrast that here he is, the justice of the peace, harboring runaway slaves, and he did it because he felt that he had a higher law to fulfill, even though he was enforcer of the laws of the township, he also believed he had a responsibility to enforce the laws of God. And that meant to harbor and take care of the runaway slaves. We'll see more about this in just a few moments. There are trains that came through, and the trains, I believe, had a lot to do with why Gary's Mill settlement finally collapsed. It's because the train that, this is the first train, we'll just start here. In 1804, the first locomotive was invented in England. And there was you can see here in New Hampshire, this is what a train looked like originally. It was pulled by a horse on tracks. And then you had the Tom Thumb built in Baltimore, Maryland in 1829. So this was big time technology back in that day. And then they had the famous race in Baltimore, whether a horse or a train could win. In this race, the horse did win by just barely, but the train proved that its worth, even though it lost the race. And with this race, even though the train lost, it caused everyone to want to start laying tracks for trains in their particular counties across our country. Here was the Atlantic, built in 1832 in York, Pennsylvania, and this is what it looked like, the train in that day. Not much compared to what we have today. And here are the people, the passengers, and how it's almost as if they're on carriages that would have been pulled by horses, but now they're being pulled by a train, and they're sitting on top. This was the first train to go through Illinois, northern Illinois, and it's called the Pioneer. You can see it has more of a look of a modern day locomotive, but it's very small. And it ran from Chicago, and it finally made its way to Turner Junction. And then from Turner Junction, which made it cross right through the area of Gary's Mill settlement. And then it turned north to Elgin and worked its way to Galena in the corner of Illinois. You can see here's the route it took. And the original project route had been from Elmhurst, where Gary Bates had been given the right-of-way to his adjacent store, continuing through Lombard with plans calling for it to follow the St. Charles Road. This was the original plan. You can see how this is, how do I say it? This is the original plan, which would have gone with the yellow line and then would go north. But the Wheatons got involved, and they talked to the owners of the railroad and were willing to give them free land if they would alter the course of the railroad and angle a little bit south, which would take in Danby, which is currently Glen Ellen, Wheaton, Winfield, which was at that time went by the name of Fredericksburg, and then do Turner Junction here, and then shoot north. So this was the original plan, which was more of a straight route, but they changed the plan to take in these towns. And when they did that, it made Wheaton a very valuable place to live, Winfield a valuable place to live, Turner Junction a valuable place to live. But it was about 2 miles north of Gary's Mill settlement. And that spelled doom for Gary's Mill settlement because it couldn't get the lumber as easily to the railroad because of the distance it had traveled. And here you can see that same railroad. It went all the way through Elgin, then it made its way finally to Freeport, and then from Freeport to Galena. What reasons why the Gary's Mill settlement collapsed? The Galena-Chicago Union Railroad bypassed Gary's Mill settlement. Erastus Gary and Wheaton brothers plots generated a 4 square mile opportunity for settlement that had been east of the Gary's Mill settlement. People began to populate that area as opposed to Gary's Mill settlement. You can see here's Gary's Mill's parcel, Wheaton's parcel. This would be Erastus's parcel. This would be Warren's parcel right there in the middle of what became Wheaton, the city of Wheaton. And Warren also bought another parcel just to the south, which would be south of Roosevelt Road, current Roosevelt Road, along Warrenville Road. And then this was Jesse's parcel right here, which was the south of Erastus parcel. So these 4 squares became very attractive for people to settle there. And they began to settle there rather than Gary's Mill settlement, which was farther to the west. Third reason, Erastus Gary and the Wheaton brothers were willing to give plots away for free to anyone willing to build homesteads immediately. That's part of the reason why they came there. And Charles Gary was more interested in preaching the gospel than he was in forming a town. Like I said earlier, that was his first calling, was to be a preacher. The Underground Railroad. Now here it's the Northwest Territory, and there was to be no slavery or involuntary servitude. This is in the 1787 ordinance, except as punishment for a crime where the person shall have been duly convicted. So you could become a slave as part of your conviction. The governor, Nina Edwards of the Illinois Territory, decided the ordinance did not apply to slaves already in existence, to slavery already in existence. So if you were a slave already, you had to stay a slave after this ordinance was passed. The Black Code of 1818-1832 subjected all people of color who entered Illinois to arrest and fine. In case that they could not pay the fine, they could be required to pay cost in labor. In other words, if you were a person of African American descent, you were not welcome in the state of Illinois. Also, it permitted slaveholders to claim and repossess fugitives upon payment of costs. So this allowed slaveholders to come into Illinois to chase down their runaway slaves. They placed a heavy fine on any white person bringing free or enslaved people of color into Illinois. And it permitted slaveholders to claim and repossess fugitives upon payment of costs. So all that to be said is that even though Illinois was technically a northern state and technically was not part of the culture of slavery, it was not all that friendly to slaves either, or to the African American population. It was kind of a border state, so it had a mixed culture. The Illinois Constitution of 1848 said this. This was their constitution, and there's a quote from it. The General Assembly shall, at its first session, pass laws as will prohibit free persons of color from immigrating to and settling in this state, and to effectively prevent owners of slaves from bringing them into this state for the purpose of setting them free. This was very anti-abolition. A pro-slavery riot in Alton, Illinois, near St. Louis, led to the death of an abolitionist and newspaper editor, Elijah Lovejoy, in 1837. You get a sense for the attitudes of the people who lived in Illinois at that time. Sympathy for runaway slaves. Abbess Blodgett was a DuPage settler whose abolitionist convictions led her to assist those who were caught by a bounty hunter. So you did have people that were in favor of abolition, the abolitionist cause, also in Illinois at that time. And here you see in these red lines the Underground Railroad, how it went. Here in DuPage County, you can see how it went from the south, worked its way north, and then when they would get to Fort Dearborn or Chicago, they would sneak them onto ships, and then they would sail up the Lake Michigan, around Lake Huron to Lake Erie, and then to Ontario, Canada. And this was considered to be their goal, to get to Canada, and specifically Ontario. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, the great emancipator of the slaves, he had to grow into that way of thinking. You have to remember, he was a product of the culture of Illinois himself. And earlier in his life, he was what we would call today a racist, but he grew out of it. That's the important thing. He grew out of it. But this is a quote that he said during the Stephen Douglas debate in 1858. He said this: "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. Very racist to make a statement like that. And it goes on further. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And as much as any other man am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. Now, again, that's Abraham Lincoln back in 1858. That is not Abraham Lincoln in 1864, 1865. He was the great emancipator, but he had to grow into that. He was born into the culture and attitudes where racism was prevalent, and he bought into it initially, but he left it and became the man that we know him for today, the man who worked to put an end to slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 forcibly compelled citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. It denied slaves the right to a jury trial and increased the penalty for interfering with the rendition process with a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. $1,000 in 1850 equals $30,000 in 2016. That gives you an idea of what anyone who was involved in assisting the slaves to get freed from the South, in other words, be part of the Underground Railroad, this is what they were risking themselves if they were caught. A $1,000 fine, the equivalency of $30,000. Charles Gary was willing to risk that of his own livelihood to help the blacks get freed from the South. And like I said, there you go. He lived just down the road from us. Quite a man. And here we can see the route of the Underground Railroad in our area. It went to a man named John Fairbanks, whose house is just a little bit south of the Gary's Mill settlement, a little bit north of Batavia Road along Route 59. And then the slave would, in the nighttime, would walk over to Gary's Mill settlement and get lodged in Charles Gary's house. And then again, at nighttime, he would work his way to Wheaton College, which also had a place to protect the slaves. And then from there, they went to a man's house named Thomas Filer. And from Thomas, and that would be in present day Elmhurst. I'm sorry, Glen Ellen. And then from there, they went to Sheldon Peake's house, which is in Lombard. And from in there, he would take them straight to Fort Dearborn, which would be Chicago. He'd put them in a wagon, cover the wagon up with blankets and different things to hide them. And the wagon would go all the way to Lake Michigan. And they would hide them in the Tremont House in Chicago. And then from there, they would board them on a ship. Here's a picture of the Sheldon Peck homestead, which you can go to today. It's a museum. And there's a lot of information in there about the Underground Railroad, and it's worth taking to visit. Here's a picture of the Tremont House in Chicago, which was used to protect the slaves when they made it this far. And here's Wheaton College at the time, what it looked like. And it too was a place used to harbor the runaway slaves. Here you have Jonathan Blanchard, was a famous abolitionist, Lyman Beecher, Edward Beecher, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. They all had a role in getting the slaves free from the South. Distinguished residents. One of our distinguished residents of the Gary's Mill settlement is a man by the name of Albert Gary. He was the son of Erastus Gary. And he became the mayor of Wheaton. And then he was asked to be the CEO of U.S. Steel. This is to me an incredible element. He didn't want this. He did not want this job, and he said no multiple times. But he was back in again and again and again, and he finally took it. And he advanced U.S. Steel to what it became, the first billion-dollar company in the United States. And he is also the principal financier of the Gary's Memorial Methodist Church along Main Street in Wheaton. And here is his, I guess you would call it a mausoleum, that is in Wheaton Cemetery. Rather than just having a marker in the ground, he has actually a house where his casket has been placed. Albert Gary served two terms in DuPage County Judge from 1882 to 1890. He was president of the Chicago Bar Association from 1893 to 1894. 1898, he became the president of the Federal Steel Corporation in Chicago, and then he served as the CEO and president of the first billion-dollar company in the USA, U.S. Steel. So the reason why I said earlier that the little two-room schoolhouse in Gary's Mill settlement had a major role to play in us winning the Second World War is because without the product that was produced through the industry of U.S. Steel, we would not have been able to produce the tanks and the ships and the airplanes to fight that war. And as historians will tell you, it doesn't matter how good a general you have. If you don't have planes, ships, and tanks, you're not going to win. And we were able to produce more planes in that war than all of the other countries that were participating in the Second World War combined. And we were able to produce ships at an amazing rapid speed, one ship after another, to create a fleet that was hard to beat. And that's why I'm saying to you, and he, by the way, Albert Gary, was a little boy who went to that school in Gary's Mill Settlement. So we have a young boy who came from that school, who had that much influence in us winning. I mean, he was dead by the time the Second World War came about, but he had taken U.S. Steel and made it into the company that it became. So he had a major role to play in us, I believe, in winning that Second World War. The town of Gary, Indiana was laid out in 1906 as a model home for steel workmen, was named after Albert Gary's. It was named in Albert Gary's honor. 1914, Albert Gary was made chairman of the committee appointed by the mayor of New York City to study the question of unemployment and its relief. When America entered the World War I in 1917, Albert Gary was appointed chairman of the Committee on Steel of the Council of National Defense. So he had a role in the First World War, but even after his death, his influence extended to the Second World War. Another distinguished alumnus of that small little school in Gary's Mill Settlement was John Gates. He was a seller of barbed wire. And he didn't invent the barbed wire. That was invented in DeKalb. But when he became their salesman, he took it to the south into Texas, and he showed the rangers, the people who had the livestock, that they no longer had to build these wooden fences to keep the livestock corralled. All they had to do was a much less expensive way, which was by barbed wire. At first, nobody believed him, nobody wanted to buy his product. But after showing its effectiveness in county fairs around Texas. He began to get all kind of orders. And John Gates himself became very, very wealthy. He became the CEO of the American Steel and Wire Company, later bought out by J.P. Morgan. He became the financier of Spindletop Oil Drill in eastern Texas. At the time, nobody believed there was oil in Texas. But the people who were drilling kept saying that we believe that this spot here will produce oil. And John Gates believed them. So he financed the drilling of that spot. And it became the number one producer of oil throughout the United States. And today, Spindletop is considered to be it's like a legend among those in the oil industry. And so because of his financing of Spindletop, he also was able to draw income from the oil that came from that hole in the ground. And he was able to become the founder of Texaco Oil Company. Here's the emblem of Texaco. Now, you don't see that anymore around, but I remember as a young boy that Texaco was one of the major gas stations in our country. He was the founder and CEO of Texaco. And then he became the CEO of Pittsburgh and Gulf Railroad. All this to say, here's a young boy who was schooled in that little schoolhouse in Gary's Mill Settlement. And he became one of the major industrialists and toward the turn of the century in the United States. And because of our ability to produce oil at such a massive quantity, we were able to fight the First World War effectively. And we are also able to fight effectively in the Second World War. You take away the oil, you take away our ability to win. And that's why I say that that little settlement in Gary's Mill and that little schoolhouse in the Gary's Mill settlement had a major role to play in us winning the Second World War because of these two men, John Gates and Albert Gary. This is more pictures and more slides about the barbed wire. I don't need to go much into that. Here is the Spindletop geyser, financed on January 10th, 1901. Spindletop struck oil. The gusher blew for 9 days at a rate of 100,000 barrels of oil per day. Texaco was formed to develop the production of Spindletop. John Gates owned 46% of the stock, and he was able to form Texaco Oil Company. And here is Gary's Mill School once again, which no longer exists. And here it's being destroyed by a bulldozer. Again, being destroyed by the bulldozer in 1988. And here's a woman who tried her hardest to save that building and failed. The demolition of the 136-year-old Gary's Mill School Wednesday morning should stand as a final lasting lesson to the people of West Chicago, according to Alice Minaga. Minaga, who resigned from the West Chicago Historical Society last week after a 4-year frustrating fight to save the school, said she hopes people have learned something from the loss of the school. What can we do to not let other sites slip through our fingers? Hopefully this has taught us to have more foresight in the future, Minaga told the press. For some of the old timers, there was the Neltnor House, which we didn't preserve and lost to fire. Now we lost Gary's Mill. That's 2 strikes and that's enough. If we lose one more, we strike out. And I think that was printed in the newspaper called The Press in 1988. With that, I'm going to close my presentation this evening and open it up for any questions that someone might have.